Thank
All
you.
right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. Today, I will be presenting on reimagining occupational health and safety in a changing world. And this presentation hopefully will be a little bit more interactive than previous ones because I really want to get your feedback on your experiences that you've been having as safety and health professionals. So I want to go through a brief outline of today's lecture. I'm going to start by having a broad discussion about the top challenges facing industrial hygienists and safety professionals today. And so I want to start by having a curiosity of changes and have you guys share where you've had experiences in that the world looks very different now than it did years ago. I'm going to share with you my top 5 challenges that I think industrial hygienists and safety professionals face in today's climate. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we weren't prepared for, at least I wasn't prepared for, and how I am actively seeking continuing education. While I teach in the professional master's degree program, I've shared with everybody that I've been also actively educating myself as we go forward. And I think one of the best parts of our professional master's degree program is this sort of growth mindset that we're continually growing and adapting and changing as the world is changing, and not sitting in a stagnant sort of esoteric framework for education, but really learning as much from our students as we are from sharing information with them. And then we're going to have a little brief discussion about where there are gaps. There is a window for policy action, and kind of open this dialogue of, do there need to be changes made to regulatory frameworks? And then, because I've not really given this presentation before, and I don't know how long it's going to take me, if I have time, I'm going to go into how I kind of came across all these challenges, and these challenges emerged when I was doing my dissertation research. And this is really the reasoning behind it. So in the chat window, I want to hear, what are the biggest challenges that you face as a safety and health professional? What is really challenging? What is hard? What is difficult? What has you saying, what do I do in this situation, even though you've been doing it for 20, 30 years? Tell me, what are you thinking? Let me see if I can open up the chat window. And so Susan shared that there's gaps between animal health and human health. Great. So, and Susan brings this up, this idea of zoonotic diseases, and really how that's going to change, especially with climate change. Nelson shared battling poor safety culture. Travis shared management buy-in. Michael shared how to educate the workforce. Cedra shared about disease-related health and safety issues. Great. And these are all really great ideas and concepts. And I think what you're going to see is, and Ebenezer shared some human error factors. When I have been really kind of looking at all these different factors and all the ones you've listed and more that I've come across through both my activities with OSHA consultation and with outside research that I've done, and with my doctoral research that I was working on. And Susan added areas with no regulation, which is great. I really coalesced around my top 5. So I'm going to share with you my top 5 list on and where I'm really seeing a lot of challenges, looking at how do I address things based off of where I've come from. So the first area of interest, number 1, is external factors impacting job sites. And so this really covers anything. So I have a job site, but there are factors that are impacting the work that my workers are doing that I did not create those hazards. And so examples of that were climate change and infectious disease. And these were brought up by you all in the chat, where You have diseases that are cropping up that you're having to address on the job. Are there zoonotic diseases or issues with animal exposures and human exposures that you're trying to move back and forth between? Are there concerns related to natural disasters? Are there concerns related to heat stress? And so we're really looking at, I have a work environment, but I am now having to think, are we starting at 4 in the morning now instead of 6 in the morning so we can get done earlier and be able to address the concerns and work that needs to be done without having heat stress related issues? So the first area is really these external factors that are impacting work. The next area of concern is the way we work. And this is really, I want you to think real broadly about this topic, because this is something that I think is one of my biggest challenges, especially as an industrial hygienist, because as an industrial hygienist with our OSHA consultation program, when we go out to a company, we have to have approval by the controlling employer to do the air monitoring. And we also have to have approval to be able to present those results back and to get meaningful change. But if we're in a multi-employer work site where there's a host employer and then there's subcontractors, and there are unique contractual agreements between all these different worker groups, it becomes increasingly more challenging to see who owns that exposure and how do I monitor for it and how do I regulate that exposure. So thinking about the way we work, when I first started over 20 years ago, oftentimes I would be going out to a company and I would see that there are, X number of workers, and then maybe there might be a couple temporary workers as a stopgap measure because they may be growing, but it wasn't really the way that that company was working. But now when I go out to companies, there is usually really complex worker arrangements, and they use lots of different words to describe these arrangements. So it makes it confusing from another perspective of just understanding what's happening. So we have contractors, we have day laborers, we have temp workers, we have full-time workers, we have part-time workers, we have gig workers. Really, that contractual arrangement is really a driving force on who is accepting the risk when it comes to work. And that can make it really challenging, not only for the safety and health professionals, but really put vulnerable workers who do not really comprehend or understand the risk that they're incurring to accept more of the risk than they should be accepting. The third area where I see there being a lot of challenge is where we're working. Yesterday, I attended, or maybe it wasn't yesterday, it was the day before, I attended a session with the group that our Safety, Health, and Environmental Services is housed within the Enterprise Innovation Institute, and they are doing fascinating work and all over the globe. And one of the projects that they're working on is in Colombia, and they were talking about creating all of these different maker spaces where people can come and do entrepreneurial work where they're developing and creating new things. And me, as a safety and health professional, thinks, oh my gosh, who is making sure that this is done safely? Are there guards on the machinery? Who is making sure that there isn't dust inhalation from the 3D printers? The way that we're working in where we are working is really intrinsically changing from a day to day. It also is challenging because we are creating these different groupings of workers. So we have the home workers that are working from home, and there's all of the challenges with where are there barriers for privacy from the home office to the workplace. There are offices, and a lot of offices are shifting to more shared space working. So, me as a public health professional, I think, okay, well, we're not in offices where people are segregating themselves to potentially create additional space if they're coughing. So now we've got a bunch of people touching all these surfaces and potentially spreading disease and whatever viruses are going around. Um, and then you have sort of the challenges of a lot of field work. And so some of the companies that we're working with now, they may be able to manage the risk inside their brick and mortar actual manufacturing plant, but where they're really struggling is the guys that are going out into the field and doing the work, whether it is vehicular accidents that they're dealing with, or driver safety related issues, or it's issues that are happening in the field. So, this concept of where we're working, who has control or oversight of that location, and it can get really tricky. I was talking to one individual in one of my classes where they said, I had to put up an exit sign in my home office because my employer required that. And I thought, oh my goodness, I can't imagine if Paul asked to come to my house and put up exit signs in my bedroom because I'm working in the corner of my bedroom. I mean, that seems absurd, but these are the new emerging challenges that many people are facing as where we're working is changing. The next area, and the fourth area of concern that I think is really emerging, is what we're working with. And from my perspective, the beauty of today and the era that we are living in is that science is progressing so rapidly and so many amazing things are being developed. The problem with that, and inherently the challenge that we face, is that we are dealing with a lot of materials and products that we know absolutely nothing about related to toxicology. And as we see things emerge as being particularly hazardous, we are then having to retroactively go back and say, okay, how do we speed up that regulatory process to catch up with this lightning speed of development? The perfect example of this is 3D printing, or additive manufacturing processes. When we look at industrial hygiene exposures, we typically measure them based off of a weight of an exposure to an element. But when we look at additive manufacturing or 3D printing, what we're typically dealing with are nano-sized particles, and particles that are much smaller than we have previously worked with in the past, and which we do not have um, congruent regulations to kind of adapt to that. So if you're working with aluminum, and I know what the permissible exposure limits are for aluminum, I may think, okay, this is acceptable if we're dealing with aluminum metal and we're cutting and grinding on it. But if we're doing aluminum 3D printing and people are potentially breathing in nano-sized particles, they may be vastly below any occupational exposure limits. But from my perspective, I may not feel certain that they are um, not necessarily being harmed or potentially being exposed to levels that could cause harm, because we are learning that the biological mechanisms and the inflammation response in the lungs is very different depending on the size of the particle that somebody might be exposed to. So, what we're working with is really challenging. And if you've been in any of my classes, one of the ones that I've really been harping on is engineered stone, or quartz countertops. And I'm going to be flying out to California in 2 weeks to be part of a working group and a conference related to the engineered stone. And, that is a tricky element, because what the main hazard is silica exposure, which is something that we've known about for decades, for hundreds of years, actually. that can cause harm. But on the reverse side, what we're finding is that the dose is so much greater. The exposure is too much smaller particulates, meaning they're finding that this material is breaking down into nano-sized particles versus what is classically seen, the more respirable dust particles when we're dealing with any sort of countertop fabrication. And then you have this weird interaction where we're really not sure how the chemicals that are used as binders to create these countertops may be interacting in the lungs with the silica exposure to cause this increased inflammation. Because whereas we would typically see workers getting sick from exposure to silica dust happening after 30 or 40 years, in this particular cohort of persons, and we've identified over 100 cases at this point in America alone, they're getting sick after only about 7 years of exposure, and they're having a much more accelerated, complex development of the disease and progression of the disease. So this concept of what we're working with is really challenging because, like one of you commented, there aren't permissible exposure limits for a lot of these newer chemicals that we're working with. And so there's nothing to really use as a benchmark of you are above or below a certain limit. And it then becomes increasingly more challenging if you're trying to do something like develop a respiratory protection program. You don't know at which point respirators would need to be required. And then if you have to develop cartridge changeout schedules, how do you do that when you are dealing with this abstract idea of an exposure where you don't know what is particularly considered acceptable or unacceptable? And then the final area, the fifth area, is what's changing, is who we are working with. And in some of the ways, this hasn't changed. In some of the ways, this has changed dramatically. The average American worker looks very different than they did in 1970 when OSHA was developed and created. So we are dealing with increasingly more diverse worker populations. We are dealing with these very complex, interactive, multiple companies that are collaborating and working together, sometimes under a shell umbrella company. We have people that are working in these sort of shared spaces where you might see somebody rent out an entire worker area and then rent out individual spaces to do entrepreneurial work with, you know, capitalism, for instance, and you have stakeholders and shareholders. You have the demands and requests and needs of what they want in terms of the growth that people are responding to. You may be dealing with issues related to supply chain and vendors, like who is giving you information, who's not giving you information. And I'm sure many of you experienced a tremendous shift in the way that work and who you were required to work with happening over the COVID pandemic, where suddenly you were being asked to serve in a public health role, whereas a lot of you had never had primarily public health training and had not been brought up or educated on the frameworks that really shape the way a health department will respond to an event. But then you're having to interface with these health departments and adapt some of their policies and procedures. So this concept of who we're working with is also kind of evolving and growing in a manner that you know, one of the biggest challenges that I know from my perspective we face is what we're seeing happening is a lot of smaller businesses are being bought by, and I'm not really sure what the correct term is for it, but they're being bought by holding companies. And they're basically companies, shell companies that are investing in small companies as just sort of part of their portfolio. And so what that does for us when we work at something like an OSHA consultation program is suddenly we can no longer help this small business because they went from being a small business to technically being classified as a large corporation, because they are held by a corporation that now has thousands of workers under its umbrella. And so that is one really small example of the way that businesses are functioning and how they're working together has made it so that we've had to turn a lot of companies that we've helped in the past away because they no longer qualify for our services, even though intrinsically they still need them just the same as they did previously. So this is where I want to pause and really open it up to discussion and really think about like the toolbox that I was trained to use versus the toolbox I need on a day-to-day basis has really evolved over the past 20 some years that I've been working. I know that when I first was trained, I thought I could just go out and do welding fume sampling and dust sampling. But more often than not, I am spending more time calling the lab, asking really detailed questions about specific types of chemicals, and having to do a lot more research than I ever thought I would have to be doing at this stage in my career, because the chemical landscape has been changing so much. So that is one example. Um, I mean, we could say we weren't prepared for all the Zooming that we would be doing and all the electronic interface. And that's something that we've had to learn how to develop and use and deal with. So does anyone, and you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat window, want to share, what is a tool that you were not trained with, the toolbox that you were given when you first started as a safety professional, and that you've had to learn? And it's, maybe for us with our professional master's degree program would be something that you'd want to know how to use, from taking our classes. Anybody? You can put it in the chat window or raise your hand. Let me see if I can pull this up. So Cedra put blood pressure machine. Yeah. And Cedra, is that for you because your stress levels have changed with being a safety and health professional over time, or the fact that we are learning objectively from science that stressful work environments do lead to adverse health outcomes for workers? I'm curious. Or is it a mixture of both? Yeah, so Cedra put most issues have with employees on the line who have high blood pressure. That is, I think, one of the broader challenges we face is the overall health of the American public has shifted and changed. And so you are dealing with issues related to high blood pressure, that could lead to adverse health outcomes. And a lot of it is a complex mixture of a total worker health, that would need to be addressed. Susan shared advanced statistical analysis skills to make sense of all the data available now and to use it for decision making. Yeah, the management of, and I'm glad Danielle brought up AI. We're really in this brave new world where we're literally drinking out of a fire hose of information that's being sent to us. And the hardest challenge is you may be getting information and maybe 60% is actually valid and useful, and the other 40% is false information. And you're having to go through and tease through what is accurate information, what is not accurate information, and how do you synthesize it. And then to speak to the AI aspect of it, you know, when I was working on my dissertation, I used a qualitative analysis software, to do my analysis. And I did two things. I used AI to transcribe and to create transcripts of all of my interviews that I did. And one thing I learned from AI is they do not understand a lot of occupational safety and health words. For example, every time somebody said something about a PAPR or a powered air purifying respirator, it was transcribed as a pepper, like the vegetable. And so there are some clear failures with AI tools where they may not understand the nuance or the specificity that is found within a niche market like safety and health. Um, and so you have to know what their limitations are and how you can use them, but then also where you need to double back. So I used AI to get transcriptions of all my interviews, but I also had to then re-listen to my interviews with the transcripts and correct all the transcripts to make sure that they were accurate. So I do think it is a huge challenge. Trying to navigate this new technology and making sure that we're doing it in a manner that is both accurate and also ethical, because there are some challenges with you using AI that could potentially violate people's privacy and violate people's personal and private health information. And, a lot of times in our office hours for my IH class, we get into really, deep discussions about, can I use this sensor and gather all this personal information, and where is that information stored and how is it protected and that sort of thing. Travis shared learning about 3D printers and their health effects. Our base has been rapidly purchasing these and utilizing them, not to mention one we can actually make aircraft engine components the size of cars, and they didn't exist. Yeah. And honestly, I feel like 3D printers are the best and worst thing that's ever happened, because think about it. It is amazing that you could be in battle overseas and need a very specific tool, and then you'd be able to 3D print it and solve your problem in the middle of a crisis. That's amazing. But what is also scary is we do not know what the long-term health impacts are. And they are putting 3D printers everywhere, in elementary schools, in middle schools, in colleges, in maker spaces. You can go and order one, and there's very limited information about the health effects. So I think there's this huge acknowledgement of, we have no choice but to be lifelong learners, and we have no choice but to constantly be reassessing, what are the tools that I have in my toolbox, and do I need to have continuing learning? And I think that's why programs like this speaker series are so incredibly helpful, because we want to continue this dialogue. We want to have this conversation of saying, okay, where are you in the field struggling, and how can we help you get to a point where you better understand and can better serve the workers? So I don't know how many of you have seen the Barbie movie, but I have two girls, and it is like an epic, my girls loved it. We watched it multiple times so far. But I love the scene in this movie where Kate McKinnon, who played Weird Barbie, and I very much feel like I'm Weird Barbie much of the time, because I'm constantly being my authentic self, but also really trying to just figure things out. And, Barbie has to decide, does she stay the way she is and continue walking down that path of what she thought her life was supposed to be? Or do you grab the Birkenstocks and figure it out and look for a new path, for a new solution? And I think that's really my challenge to you all sitting in on this conversation, is to think about, what are we doing that we've done for years? And I know how many times we go out to a company and we hear them say, well, we've been doing this forever. And we are having to push people constantly into this very uncomfortable, very weird state of change. And change is uncomfortable, and change does feel strange and weird and a little alarming. But it's also necessary, because if you are not adapting and changing, you potentially could find yourself really getting stuck. And Crystal, yeah, especially after COVID, I think a lot of us are really having this, um, part of me like yearns for the time pre-COVID when I knew what I needed to do on a day-to-day basis. But now I have to really sort of be open to an idea that A, it's never going back to the way it was, but B, um, really embracing this constantly change that you're dealing with, and then trying to see where safety and health fits in that. So Nelson wrote, that's exactly what I'm dealing with currently. Company doesn't want to progress in any capacity. Yeah. And a lot of it is literally a form of traumatic stress response from having to adapt to so much change during COVID. I don't think we've even begun to unpack how much the emotional and psychological impacts of what everyone experienced during COVID is going to have long term on the way that we work. And the way people adapt to working, and really the way people perceive that work should be done, because companies are really, really dying to go back to the way things were, or to create a constant when there may not be a constant in the future. And I think it's a struggle. And I think it's good that all of you have each other as peers to reach out to and say, hey, how are you managing this in your world? So, one way that we do manage it is through policy. And in the world of policy, we think of it really in two different streams. I call it big P and little p. So, a big P policy is really anything that is basically a law or regulation. So, I'm looking at that in the first two categories of state and federal policies are, and for us in safety and health, we have OSHA, we have NIOSH, we have the CDC, we have, if you are in a state with a state OSHA, you have the state OSHA rules. And then there is information coming out of state health departments. The little p are policies and recommendations that come from other areas. So that could be an internal company policy. Is there a corporate policy? Is there a site specific policy? And then looking at it, for our perspective, are you interacting with the association, the American Industrial Hygiene Association, or the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, or ASSP? And are professional associations coming out with policies? So I know that there have been recent publications, and I'm totally blanking, but I don't know if it was ASSP or a different one, just came out with a heat stress standard. And so that is incredibly beneficial when you have professional associations coming out with these standards where there's obviously a need for information, and there isn't the framework from a federal level to address it. And so you have to kind of reach out to those other organizations to see how that works. Let me see here. We have a comment here about, I see some regulations being obstacles to necessary change. Contractors seen as totally separate entity with their own workers' comp and own OSHA regs, but what the contractor does affects the rest of our company. Yeah, and there's a lot to that when you have organizations setting different bars. And really, how do you manage it, especially for you, where you're dealing with animals, not just humans, but also animals that you have to protect? You have a lot of vested living beings in that environment, for sure. And recently there's been two really major milestones in the past month. But they're kind of disappointing milestones. I mean, they're not disappointing. They needed to happen. But these are not revolutionary ideas. One is the banning of asbestos, which many of you may have been thinking, gosh, hasn't asbestos been banned? And thinking, we're finally getting to this. And then the other is tomorrow they are finally publishing a silica standard for the mines. And so while these are incredible, absolutely necessary policy changes, these two policy changes represent a policy change in an area where there is unequivocal data showing the disease and exposure connection. If you get exposed to asbestos, you develop asbestosis. If you get exposed to silica, you get silicosis. So what do we do with the rest of it? Like all the other exposures where you may or may not develop lung cancer, or you may or may not develop an allergy from exposure to those chemicals. These are slam dunks, if you ask me. I can provide a exorbitant amount of data and information showing you that disease exposure connection. It's just like, why did it take so long for us to get to these regulatory changes or these major milestones? And so that's why it's so important for us as safety and health professionals to not only wear the I'm getting my company to comply role, but to also participate in the overall process of being aware of where the exposures are, where there is changing health risks, how you can be involved with your professional to publish white papers stating concepts and ideas and opinions about the scientific research that needs to take place to better protect workers. Because when we look at problems, you can't just change regulations on a whim. There's what we would, and my doctorate was in public health policy, which is why I'm diving into this, if you will. But you start looking at things as being three different areas. We have the problem stream, the politics stream, and the policy stream. And there's this finite window of opportunity. And it's so funny that they published that yesterday about the mines finally passing, MSHA finally passing the silica standard, because the day before I had a conversation with a professional and they said, when do you think they're going to publish it? And I said, well, they're going to have to publish it by at least August, because in OSHA and with MSHA, if you publish a regulation within a certain number of days of a change of an administration, once you change that administration, the new administration can go back and veto that standard. And that's what happened with the ergonomic standard a few decades ago. And so it would be really challenging, because the caveat to that and the little weird catch-22 is, if a standard is then vetoed, you can't publish a new standard with the same terms. So you'd have to come up with all new words for things. I remember us all, or all the nerdy IHs, holding their breath when the beryllium standard passed, because it did pass within that time frame. So we were all waiting to see if within the change of the administration, within the first 90 days, it would be vetoed, because how would you come up with new words for beryllium? It's a metal, it's an element. You can't come up with new words for that. So I had said, the window of opportunity is closing. We need to publish the standard, or you're going to have to wait until a significant amount of time after the election. And that's just facts. That's not me stating political opinion. That is just the way that it works. When we have problems, though, a problem is just a problem. But you really have to have, and another way to look at politics is also the will and sort of wealth, does the public want to do something about this problem? And is there a concept or idea going behind it that's really pushing a story that's being told? So in Texas and in Florida, they've actually banned a lot of rules and regulations from being passed that are related to heat stress. And I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but the one for Florida just passed of a ban of passing rules to protect workers from heat stress. But there's the problem. People are dying from heat stress exposure. There's policy that's available. But the politics is really that unfortunate idea and concept that's really pushing whether or not are we making sure that everybody has access to rest breaks and shade and water on a job site, or are we leveraging concepts where we say that you can't tell a business whether or not they do that? And it's complex because you have to be really cautious that if you do come up with a control, if you do come up with a policy, that it ends up not being worse than nothing. And so it isn't just an easy fix, but we do know that something needs to be done. And when we look at how to kind of navigate this process, what we see is that it's typically a circular formula, and it starts with setting an agenda. And this can be applied both at the little p level at your company, and it can also be done at a broader, larger level when we look at the federal level, for instance. So if you look on OSHA's website, you can look up what is their regulatory agenda? What are they working on? What problems are they trying to solve? And then you go into the rule formulation stage of things. And so this is an area where policymakers in the legislature and bureaucracy or at your company take up that issue and really start thinking about what they should do about the concern or the issue. And then we get to the next part where we adopt a policy, you come up with a solution, and then you implement those rules. An example of that and what's happening is primarily the cases that they've identified with workers who have developed silicosis from working with countertops, particularly with engineered stone or quartz, have been discovered and identified in California. One of the main reasons why they've been identified in California is because they have the physicians and doctors that are actually looking for it. Silicosis can be hard to diagnose if the doctors that are interacting with these patients are not identifying that exposure, because you do have to have certain radiologists review the x-rays to determine whether or not that's silicosis nodules. And if you don't have that done, you're going to miss that diagnosis. So a lot of patients with that kind of disease end up getting misdiagnosed with things like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or emphysema or chronic bronchitis. So there's that. So they do have occupational health clinics out there that are actively seeking out and trying to find cases. What they recently did, though, is implement a policy where they did an emergency temporary standard for silica with engineered stone. And one of the things that they required now is that all workers working with engineered stone in California now have to wear powered air purifying respirators. Can anyone jump in why that may, in the actual implementation, run into some snafus? Anyone think of why that might be a challenge? Yes, money. So like a respirator could be between $25 and $100, depending on the type of respirator you get, half mask N95 full face respirator, right? When we're talking about powered air purifying respirators, we're talking $3,000 to $6,000 easily. And then you have the cost of the cartridges that have to be used for replacement. So, that is something that when I saw that in the policy, I thought, oh, wow, that's going to be hard because it's going to be so much more expensive. And will that mean that employers will not even wear anything because the respirators that they've been given or told to wear previously are now being told are not good enough? So that's where you get to the policy evaluation stage is, hopefully what they're doing is they are looking at that emergency temporary standard before they publish the final standard and really evaluating whether or not that one particular part of that policy is going to be effectively able to be implemented, or if there needs to be some sort of revision to that process. So I am going to zoom through this next part because I don't have much time, but much of me coming up with those 5 different areas has really been developing over the past 5 years or so. And I did my dissertation on respiratory protection, really looking at the question, are we failing at the last line of defense? And, the idea of my research was to look at all the different ways, and these are all pictures I've taken out in the field. We see workers wearing respirators and what's being done effectively and what's not being done effectively. So the basic idea of my research is I conducted key informant interviews with workers and employers that are managing respirator programs in manufacturing companies. I'm not going to get into too much of the details, but for a qualitative analysis, I read through hundreds of pages of transcripts and looked at all these different words that kind of stood out to me, and really looked at what did I see consistently over all those worker populations. And so what ultimately I ended up noticing is that there were these 4 consistent factors that I observed in all the themes that emerged when I was looking at why, at the end of the day, does a worker wear a respirator effectively or not? So the first thing that I encountered was that there is an incredible psychological impact with wearing a respirator, and that ends up being a huge challenge for whether or not workers want to or not want to. And a lot of it has to do with their perception of risk, how comfortable they are, and, really how do they identify? Do they think respirators don't work? Do they think that wearing a mask is really a violation of their independent rights? And a lot of these things kept coming up over and over again. And the next area, and I can always talk to you about this more for ad nauseum on the side if you want to know more of it, but it really came down to management of the programs. And we saw that, leadership and knowledge and skills and abilities, and then the time and resources that companies really invest into it, are another area of concern. And then, like I said in my lecture here, external disruptors end up being a huge factor. So, are we having external factors like no exposure limit, heat stress, COVID? Are you having issues with access to the respirators you want because of supply chain? And is the way the business is structured really changing? And so when I looked at all of these, the 4 factors that came up again and again were no matter what the respirator standard says, no matter what a company's policy says, there are 4 factors that really drive whether or not a worker is going to wear a respirator effectively. The first being the fit of the respirator. Are they wearing a respirator that actually fits them? And that may seem so simplistic, but there's a lot of different kinds of respirators out there. And I know that there are only certain brands of N95s that fit me. So that's one thing. The next is the acceptance and perception of risk among a worker. Every worker is going to make a decision whether or not they're going the risk of the exposure to the hazard outweighs the risk and the annoyance of having to wear the mask. And so that is a calculus that people are putting into play, and they're really deciding whether or not it's worth it to them to be uncomfortable, to be kind of exposed to the risk of heat stress from their mask versus the exposure itself. The comfort of the worker wearing a respirator is a huge driving factor. And then also whether or not you're selecting the right type of respirator based off of the complete worker experience. And what I mean by that is really looking at, if you are in a very hot environment, do you have a powered air purifying respirator? But then again, I've had conversations with companies that do engineered stone countertops. If they're wearing a powered air purifying respirator and the water is spraying into the mask, they can't see what they're doing unless we get some sort of windshield wipers installed on powered air purifying respirators. So it ends up being the wrong kind of respirator for what they're doing. So that is a real brief overview of, thinking about the different ways that you can look at a problem, like whether or not somebody's wearing a respirator, but then you can also really more broadly think about it from the perspective of, okay, I want to know if they're going to wear a respirator, but I want to know why. I want to know why it's happening. So you could ask yourself similar questions to issues like fall protection, safety glass use, machine guarding use. There's all these different issues where you could just have a conversation, open up a dialogue, and say to the workforce, why are we doing it this way? And gain more information, and possibly gain additional tools to your toolbox. So I am out of time. So I'm going to turn it back over to Paul and open it up for any questions if anyone has a question or two. Oh, and somebody just asked, can cyber attacks be a workplace hazard? Absolutely. If your cyber attacks can override e-stops, electrical panels, you definitely have the risk of there being concerns for sure.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was, as expected, that was outstanding. Thank you so much.
No problem.
While you're thinking of your questions, I wanted to put up on the screen here, hopefully you can see it now, where you can get more information about PMOSH. I said just a few things about it earlier, but if you scan the QR code on your screen, or you can look at the web link info.pe.gotech.edu/PMOSH, that's where you can get more information about the PMOSH program. And by the way, there's another due date coming up in just a couple of weeks. If we have anybody out there who's thinking of submitting an application for the PMOSH program, you've got 2 weeks. May 1st is the final due date, or the final deadline. So, and of course, you can contact any of us, Jenny, myself, Dr. Ashuri. We'll be glad to talk to you about PMOSH in more detail and tell you more about the program. So with that having said, I will start, I'll unshare and we'll take questions.
And I did see there was a question about what roles can safety play to combat cyber attacks. That is beyond the scope of my knowledge. Like, I know it can be an issue, but I think that's a great question for us to do research on, and maybe come back with our next speaker series addressing something like that. That would be cool to get somebody who could speak to that concern. Yeah, I think that is an area where we need the intersection of some IT expert who understands how that could impact work. And thank you, everybody. I appreciate your support. I know I've lamented with all the students while they were students that I was a student. So we had that shared challenge.
I don't know if we have any last minute questions.
I don't see any.
Well, I want to thank everybody again for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Jenny Houlroyd, for joining us. We truly appreciate you sharing your expertise and your time with us today. And again, thank you for participating in our PMOSH Safety Speaker Series this year. I just want to reiterate the May 1st deadline for our PMOSH application. If you're interested in the program, please do submit your application by May 1st, and we hope to be able to bring you on in the fall. Thank you, everybody, again for joining us, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.